Sometimes decks in Yu-Gi-Oh can feel downright evil, especially in the current format where fiends, demons, and strange-looking creatures are dominating the meta with cruel and oppressive endboards. It can feel hopeless trying to take down these monsters, which is why you might need a deck with power and force that you've never seen before, with the ability to morph and even up the score. So here's how Super Quants work. With Emergency Teleport and Super Quantal Fairy Alpha, you can activate E-Tally to special summon Super Quantum Blue Layer from your deck. Then you can use Blue Layer's on summon effect to add a Super Quantum Mech Ship Magna Carrier from your deck to hand. After that, it's time to normal summon Alpha, and use its effect to tribute itself and choose 3 Super Quant monsters with different names in your deck. One of the monsters you choose will be randomly special summoned, while the other 2 get sent to the graveyard. In this case, we've already used Blue Layer's effect, so it's a good idea to pick Super Quantum Green Layer, Super Quantum Red Layer, and Super Quantum White Layer. This effect is random, so you don't get to choose what's summoned. However, picking these 3 quants in this instance ensures that we can always get to the same point. If a Green Layer is special summoned to your field, you can use Red Layer's Graveyard effect to special summon White Layer, while using White Layer's effect to add another Alpha to your hand. Meanwhile, if you summon Red Layer, you can use its effect to add White Layer from your grave to hand, while using White Layer's Graveyard effect as a Chain Link 2 to add Alpha. After that resolves, you can use White Layer's in-hand effect to send a Red Layer for cost so that you can special summon itself to the field. Then, this lets you use Red Layer's Graveyard effect to bring back Green Layer. And last but not least, if you summon White Layer with Alpha, you can then use White's on-field effect to send another copy of White Layer from your deck to the graveyard, and Red Layer to revive a Green Layer in your grave. Then, on a new chain, you can use the effect of your White Engrave to add Alpha from your deck or graveyard to hand. So, no matter what you summon, you'll have a blue, green, and white layer on field with Alpha and Magna Carrier in hand, which means it's morphin' time. If you activate Magna Carrier, you can discard a card to summon out a Super Quantal Mech Beast on top of a Super Quantum, so as long as they share an attribute. Blue Layer will summon out Grampulse since they're both water, Green Layer is wind and will bring out Ouroboros, and White Layer's light attribute lets you summon Lesterex. For each of your Super Quant mechs, you need to discard a card for Magna Carrier, but what you get out of those discards is a solid endboard composed of back row pops with Grampulse, a Book of Moon with Ouroboros, and an Effect Veiler with Lesterex. All of which can be used at quick effect speed since each mech beast will have their associated pilot attached. However, even through this endboard, a lot of modern strategies have the uncanny ability to make their monsters grow, which is why it's important to put a stop to them by using the second effect of Magna Carrier to send itself to the graveyard so that you can combine your 3 mechs to summon out Super Quantal Mech King Great Magnus. You're trading away 3 interactions to bring out Magnus, but it's more than worth it as it'll be summoned with 6 materials. This makes it an unaffected 3600 attack towers that can shuffle back any card on the field at quick effect speed during either player's main phase, while also continuously preventing your opponent from adding cards from their deck to their hand, putting them under a permanent drone lockbird. But before we try making Megazord, we've got to assemble a team ready to fight for justice. So let's look into this deck's ratios. Alpha, while small, is undoubtedly the leader, as he's one of the most important cards in the strategy for bringing out your quants, which is why you'll usually play my 3 copies, and potentially even more by running alongside Prerius Map, or Diviner the Herald and Trias Hierarchia. Comparatively, Blue Layer is much weaker as a normal summon. You'd rather summon it from deck using Alpha's effect or a copy of Emergency Teleport, but playing multiple copies rather than one gives your deck a ton of recursion. It makes rank 3s really easy to summon, so playing 2 copies of Blue Layer gives you the best of both worlds. Green Layer, on the other hand, is a card that's only really useful when you know that you already have a way to play. It can make your good hands a little bit stronger, but makes your worst ones even more awkward. However, it still has a lot of utility, so it's often worth playing at least 1 copy. Meanwhile, Super Quantum Red Layer is a card that you could easily run 3 copies of, especially in a pure build since it's a solid extender when drawn and has an amazing on-field effect as well as a graveyard effect that's crucial for swarming the field. However, if you're running alternate engines, you can cut Red Layer down to 2 copies instead. The final member of your Rangers is Super Quantum White Layer, another excellent extender that can change its attribute to get you to any of your mech beasts. And you can even use it as a starter to get you to Alpha in a pinch, which is why it's often played at 3 copies. In general, the ratios of your pilots are always going to be fluid, and can change depending on how you're using your quants, especially since the strategy is far from solved. If you're playing the deck pure, then you want to be playing enough of your good pilots to guarantee access to your engine, while if you're playing a hybrid version of the deck, or one more focused on Brilliant Fusion, it makes a lot of sense to cut down on names to ensure you can see your other starters. But for any of your pilots to be effective, you're going to need to play their associated mechs. Although no matter what variant you're playing, you actually only need one copy of each Super Quant mech, including Magnus itself. This seems pretty dangerous. However, any Quant card, including the mechs, can be shuffled back with Blue Layer's graveyard effect, so even if your opponent manages to break your board or out Magnus, you can recycle your resources to use them again on a later turn, which frees up a lot of extra deck space for other cards. Although if you're particularly worried about running out of archetypal extra deck tools, then it's a good idea to play 2 copies of Grand Pulse and Lusterex, since they're the easiest of your Xyzs to bring out. The only Super Quant mech that's not worth using at all is Blaster Magna, the deck's archetypal link monster, because while its effect is actually pretty solid, it requires a ton of resources to summon, and its role of regaining hand advantage that you spent on Magna Carrier is often done by just better other cards. Speaking of Magna Carrier, there's no doubt that it's one of the most important cards in the deck, as it's your main way of summoning both your Mech Beast and Magnus. But at the same time, it's also really bricky as a card that doesn't do much on its own. As a result, anywhere from 1 to 3 copies of it can make sense. If you run 1, then you can just search it whenever you know you have the resources to summon Magnus, rather than risking drawing it without any engine. While running it at 3 will make your playable hands even better, but will make your less combo heavy hands a lot worse. But in terms of archetypal back row, Magnet Carrier is actually the only Super Quant spell or trap card this strategy will run, as most of your other options range from being mediocre to downright terrible. The only other piece of Super Quant back row that you might consider running is Alpha Spike, as its graveyard effect can get you to Magna Carrier, which makes it somewhat useful if you discard it with Green Layer, or send it to the graveyard with Foolish Burial Goods. But because its primary effect is so difficult to use, it's only ever played at 1 copy, if ever at all. But now that we've assembled our team, let's take a look at their strategies, powers, and skills to see why they're worthy of being Power Rangers. Super Quant can split between 2 key archetypes. There's the Super Quantal cards and the Super Quantum cards. The Super Quantal cards are composed of the deck's back row, its Xyz payoffs, and of course Super Quantal Fairy Alpha. The main deck Super Quantals are made to enable and increase the strength of your Super Quantums. Meanwhile, the Super Quantum cards make up most of your main deck monsters, and are the necessary pieces to allow for Magna Carrier to bring out your Super Quantal Mech Beasts. Each of the Super Quantums vary in type, attribute, and level. This gives the deck a unique edge, as you can dip into a whole host of generic options that just so happen to support the stat lines of your Super Quants, even if those cards were made with a whole other deck in mind, which is made even crazier by the lack of locks on any of the Quants cards. However, while every Super Quantum is different, they do share one key similarity. They all have at least 2 effects: a win effect that triggers on summon, and an if effect that activates when it hits the graveyard. These effects vary in strength, but each one has its own utility when used in the right situation, and can turn a game on its head. Super Quantum Blue Layer is a great example of this. Blue Layer's graveyard effect doesn't seem too strong at first, as all it does is let you target up to 3 of your Super Quant cards in the graveyard and shuffle them back into the deck. However, this shuffle provides a deck with a ton of recursion, and lets you recycle your spent resources so that you always know that you'll have Quant names available for Alpha Summon and Xyz to bring out with Magna Carrier. In fact, if you can reach Magnus, then having Blue Layer attached to him can be crucial if you're only playing 1 copy of him, as if your opponent somehow manages to get your towers to the grave, you can use Blue Layer to immediately put him back into your extra deck, ready to summon out again on your next turn. Although Blue Layer's strength isn't just limited to its graveyard effect, its on-summon effect is even crazier, as it just lets you add any Super Quant card from your deck to your hand, other than another copy of itself. Essentially, this effect can unlock any part of the strategy that you could be missing. If you need to put bodies on board, you can just grab Alpha, or if you're just 1 attribute away from Magnus, then you can take White Layer instead. And of course, if you want to access your extra deck, then you can use Blue Layer to add Magna Carrier from your deck to your hand. As a result, whether or not you can bring Blue Layer to the field will often be the deciding factor between a hand that can reach Magnus and a hand that can't, which can sometimes be an issue as Blue has no way to bring itself out to the field, and there's only a 33% chance of summoning it through Alpha's effect. Thankfully, however, Blue Layer's typing lets you take advantage of Psychic-based support cards, and while there are a ton of interesting synergies that you could throw into Super Quant, the most important one by far is Emergency Teleport, since it summons Blue directly from the deck. You just have to be careful, as like the other Quants, Blue Layer's on-summon effect is a win effect, which means it can miss timing if you use Emergency Teleport as a chain link 2 or higher. But thankfully, even without this extra support, the deck has some tricks up its sleeves to make accessing the on-field effect of blue and every other quant a lot easier by using the effect of Super Quantum Green Layer. Green Layer's on summon effect is pretty basic, as it just lets you special summon a super quant from your hand, while its graveyard effect lets you discard a super quant to draw a card. If you've drawn into Green Layer in hand with a bunch of other quants, its on summon effect can be invaluable for triggering your most important quants, while also putting an extra attribute on field to get you one step closer to Magnus. But where this effect really shines is when Green Layer can be chosen as a target for Alpha. Now, discussing Alpha is where super quants become super complicated. You see, like we talked about earlier, Alpha's effect is random and gives you a 33% chance of summoning your preferred quant in any given situation. But if you've drawn into the super quant in your opening hand, then you can use Green Layer to tilt the odds in your favor. For example, if you need to summon Blue Layer and drew it alongside Alpha, you can pick blue, green, and a third quant for Alpha choices so that you'll actually have a 66% chance of summoning Blue Layer instead, either through Alpha's effect or through Green Layer's effect bringing it out from hand. And while it's not guaranteed by any means, being able to reduce the randomness of such a potentially busted effect is going to get you to Magnus more often, and win you more games. You just have to be careful and make sure that you always use Green Layer's effect as Chainlink 1, as if you use it as a Chainlink 2 or higher, your other super quants will miss the timing to use their effects. It's not just Green Layer's on summon effect that can do this either, as its graveyard effect has a similar use. The draw is a nice bonus, but the best part is, ironically, its cost. Using our earlier example, if you wanted to use Blue Layer's graveyard effect and have it in hand, then picking green, red, and white will give you a 66% chance of green hitting the grave so that you can discard blue. Or you can even have a 100% chance of using this effect if you pick blue, green, and any other quant. In general, how effective Green Layer is will always be dependent on the engine you've drawn into, and how much you have, so your mileage is always going to vary. But there's no doubt that Green Layer proves itself a worthy part of the deck. So much so that, like blue, you can rely on some powerful tools that support wind spellcasters to further strengthen green. But in terms of non-archetype synergies, the most infamous card within the deck is Super Quantum Red Layer. Unlike blue and green, Red Layer has a way to special summon itself from hand. You just have to control no monsters. And this free summon has enabled it to see play in countless Isolde-focused strategies throughout the years, as Red Layer just so happens to be a fire warrior as well. But red being a free summon is also quite useful in Super Quants, as it's a great way to get another attribute and name on the field for Magna Carrier. Especially if you get a chance to use red's on summon effect, which lets you target a super quant card in your graveyard and add it to your hand. In a deck like Super Quant, where the graveyard is constantly being filled, using this effect will often give you a dealer's choice of cards to pick from, which is really important for reoccurring your best resources, so you can either take advantage of their best effects, or so that you can just discard them for Magna Carrier. The only issue with Red Layer's first effect is that on the first turn of the duel, it's really reliant on being summoned by Alpha to trigger it. Because even with its useful free summon, it's hard to bin super quants to the grave without committing a monster to the field in some way. You can also rely on some non-archetypal tools to guarantee that you'll trigger it, but even without them, Red Layer is usually going to be part of your Alpha choice regardless. Because you can't really lose if you pick red. If it's summoned from Alpha, you get a free resource to use as you see fit. While if Red Layer is into the graveyard, you get to use one of the best graveyard effects the quants have available to them, as you get the chance to target a super quant in your graveyard that isn't a copy of Red Layer, so that you can special summon it, but you can't activate that monster's effects. This downside is pretty unfortunate, as if it didn't exist, using the on-summon effects of your quants would be a cinch. But with that being said, Red Layer's graveyard effect is one of the most important tools in the archetype, as it means that an activated Alpha is always going to convert into two bodies on field one way or another. Either Red Layer is going to hit the graveyard through Alpha's effect to summon out a second body, or you can add back a White Layer to send red to grave for its summon to use the effect anyway. And if you're trying to turbo out Magnus, the Alpha representing two super quantums is a godsend. But even if Magnus is out of reach, those two bodies can convert into a bunch of powerful generic link plays, or even rank 1s, 3s, 4s, or 7s. And that's specifically because of Super Quantum White Layer. White Layer is, without a doubt, the best extender in the deck. With an effect in hand that lets you special summon it at any point during your turn, you just have to send a non-light Super Quant monster from hand or field to the graveyard. This is a great tool to have if you're trying to go for Magnus as early as possible, because with Alpha acting as a way to guarantee two Super Quantum bodies, you can use White Layer as the third name you need by summon itself, which is especially absurd when combined with White's on summon effect. because whenever it's brought to the field, you can send any super Quant monster from your deck to the graveyard to have white copy that monster's level and attribute. This is incredibly useful for a whole host of different reasons. Manipulating white layer's attribute this way means that, with a Magnet Carrier, you can convert white into any of your mech beasts, which is useful for getting to use their effects and on your way to Magnus if you've already brought out Lusterex. Meanwhile, changing white layer's level also makes it far easier to dip into your extra deck without Magnet Carrier too, as you can match the level of another monster you have on field, and then paired with red layer's effect to give you free body to match, you can open up a ton of different options. And last but not least, getting to cycle through any of your super Quant graveyard effects that you haven't used yet is really powerful. But it's made almost absurd by the fact that you can send a second copy of white layer with this effect, which is pretty crazy given that white layer's graveyard effect is one of the best of the bunch, as it lets you add a super Quantal Fairy Alpha, the deck's best starter, from your deck or graveyard to your hand. This is incredible as it means getting white layer into rotation can represent a starter, extender, and even follow-up for the next turn. In hands that didn't draw to alpha, you can bring out white layer, send another white layer, and then suddenly you have alpha to your hand to use, which in hands that do have alpha, this effect can translate to free follow-up or discard fodder. To add another layer to how amazing this effect is, you'll likely also get the chance to use it during your opponent's turn when white layer is detached as material from Magnus, or a mech piece, which will make sure that, even if you discard the extra alpha on your turn, you can just add it back later so that even if they can beat Magnus, you have the follow-up to either rebuild or just assemble your rangers and push for lethal. Because Alphen is the card that ties the whole strategy together. Individually, the super Quants have useful effects that are difficult to use because they're either hard to summon or need the right setup. But an Alphen can let you trigger multiple different super Quant effects with just a single normal summon, letting the strategy snowball into a pretty strong engine that can win either through drowning in advantage or simply by the looming threat of Magnus. Alpha has two effects. The first is a nice bonus, as it lets you target a super Quant monster you control and makes all other monsters on your side of the field the same level as that monster, which can make using generic extenders a lot simpler when you can just change their level. You can even use Alphen to target itself to make it get into the rank 1 pool a cinch, but it's Alpha's second effect that really defines him as the deck's leader, because if you're willing to tribute it for cost, it lets you choose 3 different super Quant monsters with different names in your deck. One of those monsters will be special summoned, and the other 2 will be sent to the graveyard. This is close to being busted, but there's one key detail holding it back. The monster you summon from Alphen's effect is always going to be chosen at random. And that's really unfortunate because it means you can't always rely on it to consistently bring out the best Quant that you need for a given situation. In fact, the odds are actually against you since you'll usually only have a 33% chance of getting your preferred pilot to the field. However, even though you can't choose the monster you summon, this doesn't make the effect entirely unreliable. Quite to the contrary. Alphen is always going to be one of the most important effects to resolve because even if you land on your worst choice, you're still guaranteed something. For example, usually if you have no other engine in hand, your best choices for Alphen are going to be red, white, and blue layer. With these 3 choices, the best summon for you is going to be blue layer, as that will result in getting to use its on-summon effect to search, as well as the amazing graveyard effects of red to revive white layer, and white layer to add Alphen. And if you choose to add Magnet Carrier with blue, you can then go into both Grand Pulse and pop back row and Lusterex to negate an opponent's monster effect. But even if you summon red or white, you still get a lot out of it. If you summon red layer, you can use its effect to add back white layer to your hand after using white's effect to search for Alphen. Then you can use white to send red layer for cost and summon it to the field, so you can then use red layer's graveyard effect to revive either Alphen or blue layer, while using white layer's effect on field to manipulate its level to match the monster you summon, giving you a clear path to a rank 1 or rank 3 of your choosing. And if you summon white layer, then it's just a simple matter of using red to revive blue or Alphen and getting white to copy their level once again. These 2 worst case scenarios don't sound too amazing, but this gamble isn't as bad as losing a cup of ace or a dice jar. It just means you're ending on a slightly weaker board than you'd hope, but you're still ending on something no matter what. In general though, what you pick with Alphen is always going to vary on what you have in hand, which makes him a pretty complicated part of the strategy, and one that takes some getting used to. But once you do, an Alphen effect, no matter how random, is a force to be reckoned with, and one that's often necessary to get Magnus. But Alphen is just one part of the puzzle, as if you want to make Magnus, you'll also need a way to convert your super Quantums into super Quantal mech beasts, and use Super Quantal Mech Beast into a Mech King. And thankfully, Magna Carrier is capable of doing both. With Carrier's first effect, you can discard a card to target a Super Quantum on your side of the field so that you can special summon a Super Quantal Mech Beast with the same attribute on top of it. This effect acts as a bridge between the strategy's combo pieces and its endboard options, letting you convert a Super Quantum name that otherwise wouldn't be doing anything into a powerful piece of interaction. And notably, this effect has no once per turn in sight, which means that so long as you can keep flooding the field with Super Quantums, you can keep bringing out different Mech Beasts on top to build a pretty varied endboard, because each of the Mech Beasts have some pretty great effects. Each of them share an effect that prevents them from attacking if they don't have materials, since they need a pilot to function, which is also why they all have an effect to attach a Super Quant from your hand or field to them as a material. But it's their unique effects that make these beasts so worth it. Gram Pulse can be used to destroy any spell or trap card on the field, Ouroboros can Book of Moon a monster, Magna Liger can destroy a monster on field, while Luxorex can negate one. These are pretty amazing utility effects to have in Archetype that other strategies would kill for. But the best part of them is that these effects can become a quick effect if you have a Mech associated pilot attach them as a material, which will usually be the case if you use Magna Carrier to summon them. This turns these Mech Beasts from good utility monsters to amazing endboard options. Luxorex can stop an opponent's best enabler, Liger and Ouroboros can deal bodies, and Gram Pulse can chew through your opponent's back row. The only issue with summoning out the Mech Beast with Magna Carrier is that it's a huge investment of resources. However, if you can get 3 Mech Beasts in rotation, either on the field or in your graveyard, you'll be rewarded with the second effective Magna Carrier, which you can use by sending it from your field to the graveyard for cost, targeting 3 mechs, allowing you to summon Super Quantal Mech King Great Magnus. And then you get to attach the Mech Beast you targeted as well as all the materials to Magnus as its Xyz materials. This is not only a great way of bringing out Magnus, but also getting him enough materials to really be a threat. But the best part of this effect might just be how forgiving it is, because you don't need your Super Quantal Mech Beast to be on the field for them to be valid targets for Magna Carrier. This will likely result in fewer materials for your Magnus, but it means that if your Mech Beasts are removed from the field by your opponent, or because you needed the materials for a Link or a White Layer, you still have all the names necessary to bring out one of the most broken boss monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because if you can get Magnus to the field, you don't just have a solid endboard piece, you have a game-winning monster that more than justifies all the resources you've spent and hoops that you have to jump through to summon it. All you have to do is keep it at enough cards attached because Magnus's effects depend on the number of materials it has attached to it. If Magnus has 2 or more, it has a quick effect that can be used during either player's turn to spin back any card on the field into the deck. You just have to detach a material. This by itself is an amazing removal effect since it doesn't target either, which means that Magnus can act as its own protection whenever your opponent summons out a potential threat to your truly busted boss monster, giving you the chance to shuffle back their last hope of defeating your Megazord. But things get even crazier if Magnus has 4 or more materials, as then it will be unaffected by all card effects other than Super Quant cards. This is the effect that makes Magnus so appealing as a boss monster. In the modern game, there are a ton of board breakers and removal options that can eviscerate even the strongest boss monster out there. But with Magnus being unaffected, his staying power is almost unmatched, as most of the game's best removal tools and breakers are simply going to have no effect on him. That's not to say this effect makes Magnus impossible to deal with, as sometimes even a Megazord doesn't have the strength to beat a Kaiju. But it does mean that your opponent needs to have very specific outs to deal with the King of Computers. Outs that aren't going to be in the metagame most of the time, meaning that Magnus is likely to stick around once you've committed him to the field. Now, if being unaffected makes Magnus appealing as a boss monster, then its effect, while it has 6 or more materials, makes it downright busted, as it prevents your opponent from adding cards from their deck to their hand by card effects. Cutting off access to searching is an absurd effect, especially in the modern era where almost every archetype has a Stratos, or a way to grab their best pieces from their deck. And Magnus stopping these cards will often be enough to win games all on its own, especially with Magnus being unaffected, as it makes it even less likely that your opponent is going to be able to break this lock, as they need to have drawn their outs immediately, or else they'll be forced to try and deal with him the hard way. And even if they do, even if they somehow manage to play through Magnus's lock and shuffle and beat over it or tribute it off, you get an absurd amount of resources back, both from the graveyard effects of the Super Quantums from Magnus himself, since his graveyard effect lets you revive 3 Super Quantal Mech Beasts with different names from your graveyard. These Mech Beasts won't be able to interact with your opponent since they won't have any materials. But getting 3 bodies on your field ready for your next turn gives you an immediate way to swing the duel back in your favor with a Link 3's worth of resources that you can use to deal with your opponent's cards, or better yet, so that you can bring Magnus back into the fray. It's impossible to overstate how crazy Magnus is as a card. You might not be guaranteed every one of these effects, but every time he's brought to the field, he changes the game, and embodies everything it means to be a true boss monster. Now, that just about does it in terms of the super Quant cards that you usually see play this strategy, but there are a few more cards that, while pretty mediocre, are at least worth looking over to understand the deck's potential options. Super Quantal Alphen Strike is the best of the bunch. Its on-field effect is interesting because it's actually a board wipe that can shuffle away an opponent's entire field, but it comes with two huge downsides. The first is that your opponent gets to special summon a monster from their extra deck for free, and even ignores its summoning conditions. And the second is that you have to control 3 super quantum monsters with different names in order to activate it. And it's honestly that second restriction that makes this card so difficult to use. Getting to 3 super quantum names on board is already difficult enough, but it's almost impossible when you do it through an opponent's board of interactions and removals, which puts Spike in an unfortunate position. In order for it to be useful, your opponent needs to have a board worth clearing, but if they have a board that you want to wipe, you're not going to be able to set the necessary ways to activate it. The cool part about Spike though, is that its graveyard effect is actually pretty okay, as you can banish both itself and an Alphen to activate a Magnet carrier directly from your deck. That isn't too crazy, as it's still reliant on you being able to pop off with your other super Quant cards, but there's no denying that the extra ways to get Magnet carrier are always going to have their uses. And as a free discard for green layer, or a target for foolish burial goods, there are definitely worse options. Likewise, Blaster Magna is also a card with some fun uses. But like Alphen Spike's first effect, it's really difficult as a card to set up. If you can bring it to the field, then Blaster Magna is a decent card, as it makes up for any hand advantage you lose from Magnet Carrier, since if a Super Quant card is summoned from the extra deck to a zone Blaster Magna is pointing to, you get to draw a card for free. And this effect has no once per turn, so for every mech beast you summon with Carrier, you get a card to replace the discard that you lost from it. It even has a couple of good bonus effects. Blaster Magna can't be destroyed by opponent's card effects, and if an Xyz monster it points to is destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect, you can bring out a super Quant monster from your deck with the same attribute as a destroyed monster. Now, if you could swarm the field with enough bodies to consistently go into both Blaster Magna and Magnus every time, it would be a pretty good inclusion for the deck. But as it stands, it's already hard enough to commit the resources necessary for Magnus, so trying to force Blaster Magna isn't worth it, even with its pretty lenient summon condition of needing a Link 3's worth of materials, so long as at least one of them is a Super Quant. If you're really worried about Magnet Carrier's discard though, it's a good idea to think about including alternative engines in the deck that can make up for the Magnet Carrier's cost. Volcanic Shell used to see play in the deck for this reason. The dangers can also trigger from Magnet Carrier. And in the modern era, you'll often see Quant with the Armored Xyz package to get you some free discards. Another card with some strength is Magna Slayer, because with Slayer you can equip it to a Super Quant Xyz you control to have it gain attack equal to its rank times 100. So a Grand Pulse will get 300 while a Magnus will gain 1200. That's not all though, because while equipped, the monster with Magna Slayer can also inflict piercing battle damage. And last but not least, if you're willing to send Slayer to the graveyard during the battle phase, the monster it's equipped to can make 3 attacks. Playing Magna Slayer isn't a dreadful decision, as it can quickly enable turn 3 OTKs with its second effect, and its piercing also means that your opponent can't hide behind a wall of monsters. But these effects are all tied to trap cards that you have to set up way in advance when you won't know whether or not you're even going to be able to reach your mech beast, let alone Magnus. And if you really need OTK, you have a mountain of generic options that the deck can access, rather than trying to rely on a trap card that doesn't actually do anything to interact with an opponent. Magna Formation is in a similar boat. It's another trap card that's only useful if you prepare for it well in advance, because while it does technically give you Super Quant's targeting protection, it only protects those monsters from your opponent's effects during your main phase 1 specifically. This means that in every other phase, your opponent has free reign to target your Quants, which would be fine if you could activate Formation immediately as a way to protect from Imperm or Veiler, but because you have to wait until your next turn to get any use out of it, well, after your opponent has already had a chance to hand trap you and remove your monsters from the field, Magna Formation might just be one of the most redundant cards in the game. It does at least have an okay second effect, which is one of the only ways to get more materials onto Magnus, but if you were able to get to Magnus in the first place, you likely don't need Formation's help to win the duel anyway. And the last card in the archetype is Super Quantal Alphen Call Appeal, and it's definitely one of the worst, as it only triggers when a Super Quant monster you control is destroyed by battles specifically. The actual effect of Appeal is decent, as you get to summon out any mech beast from your extra deck and a free Super Quantum from your hand deck or graveyard, and while its effects will be negated, you get 2 free monsters on board. But the condition to use this card is just so awkward that it's not worth it. You can't use it to extend on turn 1 since you have no battle phase. You have to either set it and hope that your opponent destroys one of your monsters during your turn by battle specifically instead of relying on their other removal options, or use it when going second by committing a monster to the field and crash it into your opponent's board. And unfortunately, a 2-card combo for Mystic Tomato just isn't enough to see play in the modern era. But even though the deck has its fair share of terrible cards, Super Quant has honestly aged pretty gracefully, taking advantage of more generic tools and options as they've released to further strengthen their best cards. It's a deck that definitely is in need of more modern support to really push it to the heights of the competitive meta, but there's more than meets the eye to the strategy even in its current form.